Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continents, looking at the history and current affairs of each African nation. We are still in West Africa, but it's our last country in West Africa that we'll be exploring, and that is the country of Sierra Leone. And who better to teach us about this African nation or any African country than our returning champion, history teacher, our historical guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. Abayomi, as everyone should know, is a journalist and historian, an anti-imperialist campaigner, and more. And as always, before we start, reminder to our audience to please share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present, our playlist, and help us overcome the far-right algorithms and the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. Share us across social media and email, and please donate if you can to One Plus One at our PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form of donation, then please get in touch with me at yurismatter@gmail.com. And sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely, and it's our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. So now on to the topic at hand. So Abayomi, as always, tell us, what was Sierra Leone like before it became a British colony, and what were the conditions of the people like when it was colonized by the British?
Well, thank you once again for your continued interest in African history and contemporary affairs. Sierra Leone is a state that was largely established by the British. But prior to that, we're talking about before the latter part of the 18th century, there were civilizations there and cultures which go back centuries. They have been able to trace human settlements in the area back some 2,500 years. There was also, beginning around the 9th century of the present era, the development of iron production. There was also interaction between the indigenous peoples of Sierra Leone and others who had established cultures and civilizations among the Mende people, the Mandinka, and others. So what happened was that during the period of African enslavement and the Atlantic slave trade, around 1462, the Portuguese made initial contact with the area now known as Sierra Leone. It was named that after a mountain inside the country. The territory was used for the sole purpose of trading, that is, trading African human beings for European produced goods. And this went on for centuries. The Portuguese, of course, were the Portuguese and the Spanish in West Africa were the initial explorers and enslavers, but other European powers got involved in the whole process. The Netherlands became a major power in regard to the Atlantic slave trade and international commerce. There was also France and then Britain. Britain became the dominant country in the area now known as Sierra Leone. And what prompted the creation of this settlement was the contradictions that had arose during the Atlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. By the end of the 18th century, the whole process of the Atlantic slave trade had began to wane in terms of profitability and the capacity, particularly Britain, to maintain the Atlantic slave trade. So they domestically, inside of North America, had to deal with the restlessness on the part of the colonists, the American colonists, who were actually British. Most of them were actually British, but they wanted to break off from the British Crown in order to establish their own state. And part of the reason for this was that in the 1770s, there were several court decisions in the 1770s and 1780s, which pointed in the direction of the dissolution of chattel slavery inside of England itself. So the colonists who had built up an economy based upon chattel slavery and the Atlantic slave trade felt threatened. What if the British royalists had decided, if they decide to abolish slavery inside of the Northeast and Southeast of North America. In my opinion, and in the opinion of other historians, this was the real reason behind the so-called American Revolutionary War, which
Yeah.
in my opinion was not a revolutionary war because it maintained the enslavement of African people. It also upheld the right of private property. It also discriminated against women. So it really wasn't a revolutionary
And also
war.
continued gruesome settler colonialism and the stealing of land and the banishment of indigenous people and whatnot.
Exactly. Because after the conclusion of the so-called American Revolutionary War, which was settled on the battlefield, but there was a treaty that was negotiated beginning in 1792 and concluded in 1793 in Paris, and it was facilitated. Negotiations were facilitated by Spain and France, and they agreed to turn over the colonies in North America, the 13 colonies, to the people there who were considered the ruling class, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons,
Yeah.
and the Alexander Hamiltons and so forth, who led this push towards separation and independence. What happened during that war was that the British offered enslaved Africans freedom in exchange for fighting on their side to defeat the American colonists. And a lot of them joined. In fact, more Africans who were enslaved fought for the British than they did for the US. Later, the US, after the British, decided to make the same offer to African people that, yes, if you fight with us to defeat the British, then of course we will grant you freedom. But more Africans fought for the British. So when the British lost, one of the conditions of the Paris Treaty of 1793, the Americans wanted all their enslaved Africans returned to them, which the British refused to do because they had promised them freedom if they fought on the side of the Royal Crown during the so-called American War of Separation. So what happened? They gathered up thousands of Africans. Many of them were sent to Canada, to Nova Scotia, Halifax, and they established a settlement there. Now there were already Africans there as early as 1605, at the
Some of
beginning of
them
the
even
17th
slaves
century.
in Can. Some of them even
They were
slaves in Canada.
slaves in Nova Scotia. So they sent more from the United States to Nova Scotia. The conditions there were horrendous. A lot of people died. They were sickened. There was poverty. The weather was not conducive to what they had experienced in the southern part of the United States and even the northeast of the United States. So when this happened, they decided, well, maybe we should take them to West Africa and establish a colony in what today is considered Sierra Leone. So this was done by a group which called itself the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. And the reason why they called it that was because the Africans who had been released from slavery, those who had been brought to the UK after the American War of Separation, were living in very destitute conditions in England. So the British government had to figure out something with these people. They did not want to integrate them into the broader British society because it was very class-based. And of course, there was extreme poverty in England. Karl Marx writes in the first volume of Das Kapital, in the last section, which is about 1/3 of the book, he talks about the primitive accumulation of capital. And in that, he describes the forcing of people out of the rural areas into the urban areas and how this impacted the development of England in the period between the 15th century and the 19th century. So in the late 18th century, the Sierra Leone Company, which was a private firm, actually underwrote the transferal of Africans from Britain and from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. The first group that left in the late 1780s, a lot of people died. The conditions were horrendous. The weather was bad. Disease spread in the ships. So they had to abandon the first attempt to take Africans to Leone. Then there was another attempt, which was successful, but then in that trip as well, a lot of people did die. So they came to Sierra Leone in the late 1780s, and was set up as a settlement. But the indigenous people who were already there resented, and they saw this as an encroaching. They saw this as a major challenge to their sovereignty. So they fought the British as well as the people who had been brought there. So it was a very, very difficult situation, but eventually they were able to establish settlements there. It was called Granville, in honor of one of the British humanitarians who also was against the Atlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. So they set up these settlements, and there were problems, even going in the early days, even in the early 1820s. There were serious problems, not only from the people who were already there, but also from those Africans who had been brought there to establish this colony. They were dissatisfied with the conditions that existed in these settlements and began to involve themselves in revolts. So this is the contradiction of the whole system. On the one hand, you don't want Africans in England. So you send them to Sierra Leone. The conditions there are not conducive to human settlement. Then, of course, they are shipped out to West Africa, and even there, they meet resistance from the indigenous people, and later from the so-called Creoles. This is how they were labeled. Africans who had been brought back to the continent by the British, and they consisted of people of numerous ethnic groups. Also, a lot of people were dumped there after the 1808, when the British outlawed the Atlantic slave trade. So the British Navy would intercept slave ships that were led by Portugal or other countries, capture the Africans there, and a lot of those people were also brought and dumped in Sierra Leone. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of Africans, and also a few European colonists as well who were brought there as administrators. So this is a very, very interesting situation that had developed there. Also, we have to keep in mind that in 1827, they had captured and had brought to Sierra Leone a man by the name of Samuel Crowther. Samuel Crowther was the first student at Fora Bay College. This was a college that was set up by the British to educate Africans so they could develop some semblance of self-reliance. So Samuel Crowther was the first student there. He was originally from Nigeria, actually, and he had been captured during the Yoruba civil wars that had developed during the early part of the 19th century. These civil wars were a direct result of the Atlantic slave trade. It pitted Africans against each other, even within the same ethnic group. So he was brought as a enslaved person. He was educated and then converted to Christianity. And eventually he became a theologian as well as a linguist and a scholar, a writer. He even wrote a Yoruba dictionary as early as the 19th century. He also was involved in other types of developments. For example, he translated the King James Version of the Bible into Yoruba. So obviously the guy was extremely talented as a scholar. So the people that were brought to Sierra Leone were called Black Loyalists. That's what they were called because they apparently, according to the British, they expressed their loyalty to the British Crown in exchange for freedom. But this freedom came at an extreme price. And between the period of 1775 and 1783, of course, ended British colonial rule in what became known as the United States, even though they maintained control of Canada. So it's quite interesting. Now, there was a book that was developed, very interesting, called the Book of Negroes, which was a register of those Africans who were brought from North America to Nova Scotia, then eventually Sierra Leone. Now, this Book of Negroes actually was made into a movie. about maybe 11 years ago, 11, 12 years ago, and it was shown on the CBC as a series. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No,
You should
not even
check it
familiar
out.
with it.
It should be online. It's called The Book of Negroes, and it's based really on a true story. There were approximately 3,000 Africans who they put in a register to be repatriated to Sierra Leone. So that the movie is based on that. It deals with the U.S. War of Separation. It deals with the people who had migrated to Nova Scotia, and they also in Halifax and other places. And it also deals with the repatriation to Sierra Leone. What was interesting about the movie was that it showed how, for example, the protagonist in the film is a African woman who was fighting, for the abolition of enslavement and for the resettlement on the continent. She had been taken away from West Africa as a child, but when she was repatriated by the British, she went to look for her home village in her home area, and it was gone. It had been completely wiped out. So that shows the impact of the Atlantic slave trade on West Africa. A lot of people died. A lot of cultures and villages were eliminated, and civilizations were eliminated as well, all due to the direct impact of the Atlantic slave trade and later colonialism. So that just gives you some idea about how Sierra Leone was founded. But the Book of Negroes is a very, very interesting document, and it's a very, very interesting series. And the book was actually put together by a man named Samuel Birch, who is a very interesting character. He was over the British Museum, and he did a lot of work. He was considered a linguist, but he did a lot of work in terms of collecting artifacts from Africa and Asia. And he's really responsible for the display and the collection of African artifacts at the British Museum, Samuel Birch. And he worked with another guy named Sir Guy Carleton to develop this book of Negroes. So it's a very interesting situation.
But these are all white men. These are all white.
Yes, they were.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Samuel Birch was a British man, and he was considered a linguist. And he, of course, is in many ways considered the founder of African studies. And when I say African studies, I'm talking about the British and the European inquiry into Africa, to its history, to its cultures. And this was done largely to maintain control in regard to slavery and colonialism. So the origins of, like, for example, anthropology,
yes,
it's the same situation, to study African people in order to control them. And a lot of racist assumptions were built in to the field of anthropology as well as history throughout the years. A lot of the artifacts and artwork that was done in Sierra Leone, they were tremendous carvers. A lot of these carvings, particularly of the horns, are still in Britain right now in museums. They have not been returned to Sierra Leone. And this has been a movement all over the continent. Nigeria, Benin, they've been suing, they've been petitioning to get the artwork returned to their countries. If Africa was inferior, for example, and if we were a people who did not contribute anything to world civilization, then why do they want our art? It's a contradiction. The bronze art, the iron developed pieces, ivory as well. And a lot of the Sierra Leone artwork are based on the carving of ivory for the purpose of artwork and other things. So yes, it's quite an interesting development in terms of the history of Sierra Leone.
But this new nation that was formed, Sierra Leone. So you have Liberia is going to be coming up a lot in this conversation. So you have a country.
Yes.
So you have a country like Liberia, which was founded by a bunch of white supremacists that basically did not want to integrate freed black slaves into the body politic and society. So They give them this country, Liberia, and these freed
Hmm.
slaves unfortunately replicated settler colonialism and and black capitalism, if you will, onto Liberia. So in Sierra
Hmm.
Leone, you have freed African slaves, but it's a British colony. And okay,
Yes.
and it's not now. It's not the the slavery that we know of ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and even the horrendous slavery that white supremacists in what becomes the United States implemented. But it still is a grotesque form of colonialism with cheap labor, and basically those freed slaves that were implemented that came to Sierra Leone implemented again black capitalism and colonialism towards the already indigenous Africans in what's the that small piece of land called Sierra Leone, correct?
Yes. And they could not get beyond, though, the fact that people continued to resist and rebel. In 1799, this was about 12 years after Sierra Leone was established, there was a major revolt there, not only involving the so-called Creoles and the quote liberated Africans. Later, after 1808, they designated them as liberated Africans, and these were people who were captured from slave ships by the British and then brought back to Sierra Leone. There was a major rebellion in 1799 against the British, and the initial phase of the rebellion, the British were losing considerably. So what did they do? They went to Jamaica among the Maroons. Now, the Maroons were Africans who had escaped slavery and who had fought the British, and they had to sign a treaty with them and gave them some autonomy in Jamaica. But at the same time, they went there and told the Maroons, recruited some of them to come to Sierra Leone to help put down the rebellion there. This was in 1799. Very interesting development. So the Maroons, who are considered heroes in terms of African history because they fought against slavery, against the British, but at the same time, they unfortunately some of them agreed to go to Sierra Leone, and some actually came from Nova Scotia as well to put down a rebellion against the British in 1799. Very interesting development in this regard. After 1808, when the British outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, as I mentioned, they had so-called liberated Africans who were brought there, and they became a part of the British colony in Sierra Leone. So this went on, and there were periodic rebellions in Sierra Leone all during the 19th century. And then there was also challenges to British control during that particular time period. We talked about the Samori Touré and the Mandinka Empire, which had fought the French during the latter part of the 19th century. They also had holdings in northeastern Sierra Leone. So there was resistance to British imperialism during this particular time period among Africans in Sierra Leone, or whether they were considered Creoles or the indigenous people of Sierra Leone, the Mende speaking groups. There were Fulanese as well in the same area. So it was not a stable colonial situation that had developed. Now, during the early part of the 20th century, the resistance continued. But they also set up a company to mine diamonds inside the country. And this was called the Sierra Leone Selection Company. And they later merged with De Beers, which is a British South African diamond firm, which was heavily responsible for the exploitation of Africans in South Africa. That company still exists today. So these are some of the things that took place during the period of colonialism. But in 1884 and 1885, Sierra Leone was carved out at the Berlin West Africa Conference that was presided over by the German monarchy. And they were given this area as a result of the collaboration of other European imperialist powers. So then we had the rise of World War One, which incorporated Africans to fight on the side of the British during this particular time period, and then later World War II, which was a very similar situation. But all during this time period, the fact that you had Fora Bay College and there were other educational institutions. In fact, Fora Bay was the first European or English-oriented higher educational institution that was built in Africa in 1827. This is the first college that was built by the British in Africa in 1827. So they did educate people in English, in the Christian religion, and so forth, but it was not enough to placate them to accept their colonial status. So what happened was that you had the rise of various nationalist leaders and nationalist movements. We mentioned Samuel Crowder earlier, but then a man by the name of Isaac Theophilus Acuna Wallace, ITA Wallace, very interesting figure. He was born around 1894. He lived to 1965, but he was a key figure in the Sierra Leone nationalist movement during the period after World War One. In the 1920s, he was able to get a job as a seaman. He was a member of the Seamen's Union, which was heavily radical. And he was also a collaborator with George Padmore, formerly known as Malcolm Nurse, who was born in Trinidad. During the late 1920s, George Padmore was like the leading Black person within the Comintern, the Third International. And it was quite interesting that Padmore had done a lot of work among trade union groups. He was an advocate of national liberation. He, in fact, set up a committee of Negro workers. They also established a journal called the Negro Worker. So after 1928, at the Sixth Congress of the Communist International in Moscow, they developed a whole new strategy to recruit Africans into the Third International, into the Communist International. In the U.S., they came up. Well, there were African American communists such as Cyril Briggs and Harry Haywood and others, who many of whom were recruited out of the African Blood Brotherhood, which had developed after World War One, after 1919. In 1919, in the States, there was race programs against African Americans across the country. Chicago was probably the worst, but there were also incidents in Washington, D.C., as well as Knoxville, Tennessee, where a lot of people were killed. But what distinguished these race terror incidents was that a lot of Black folks had been recruited into the U.S. Army during World War I, and they had gotten military training. So they served as fighters against the white mobs, the police, and the National Guard. This happened in Chicago, and it happened in other cities as well. So out of that, a group known as the African Blood Brotherhood came about. And their objective was to mobilize people and organize people against these white terrorists who were carrying out all these atrocities against African people after World War I. So what happened was that later on, the communists, particularly after 1925, they set up what was called the American Negro Labor Congress in 1920. They held a conference in the United States. Did not attract a lot of people, but they did come up with a journal called the Negro Worker, and they did other things as well. The 1928 Congress, the Sixth Congress, set up what was known as the Black Belt Thesis, and that's a very interesting thesis because Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and the African Communities League had recruited a lot of people in the United States and around the world during the 1920s. Garvey, it is estimated that he had recruited 6 million people in the United States. Now, there are people who dispute that, but at any rate, he did have a significant following in the United States during the 1920s, to the extent that the Justice Department under J. Edgar Hoover, the so-called Bureau of Investigation under Hoover, as well as W. Mitchell Palmer, who was a vicious Attorney General of the United States. The so-called Palmer raids of 1919 after World War One, he initiated those. They were against anarchists and communists, and also against Black people who were radicals and who were organizers. And a lot of people were deported from the United States in 1919. But even before that, during World War One, what is often ignored is the fact that there were thousands upon thousands of people who were imprisoned and deported for opposing U.S. intervention in World War One.
Yes,
That's
no,
a topic for another program.
it's an anti-war movement and an anti-imperialist movement, which I think it's criminally overlooked. Lots of attention
Exactly.
on lots of attention on the 1960s New Left movement and its
Right.
opposition to the Vietnam War. But World War One, I've even done programs about it with David Swanson. Incredible people power movement, and incredible, even more radical left than what we have today, resisting World War One, and it's a very fascinating history in and of itself. And yes, the Palmer
Yeah, we probably have to do another program on that. But the point is that the Seamen's Union was very radical. They had very radical elements. They had very close ties with the Communist International. And George Padmore met ITA Wallace Johnson, and they collaborated together on various issues. And then Padmore left the Communist Party around 1933. Either he resigned or was expelled, and that had a lot to do with the shift from 1928 to 1932. After 1932, in 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. Now, prior to that, during the so-called period, the so-called third period, it was quite interesting because a lot of people say that Hitler would have never come to power if the Social Democrats and the Communists were able to form a united front. They could have staved off the rise of the Third Reich, but that did not happen. All right. So apparently Stalin and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union realized this, and they flipped from the period of 1928 to 1933. By 1935, it ushered in what was called the Popular Front period, where they were attempting in the United States to form a broad front against fascism and racism. And that's when they even tried to normalize relations with the NAACP, the people like A. Philip Randolph, who was involved in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He had also been in the Socialist Party. He had a newspaper called The Messenger. They, in fact, were indicted during World War One for their editorial policy opposing the war. He was not in prison, interestingly enough, because the judge at the sentencing said he did not believe that A. Philip Randolph and Domingo, W.A. Domingo, had actually written those newspapers. There's no way a Black person could write something like that. So there had to be a white person behind it. So he refused to put them in prison. Isn't that amazing? Amazing story. So in 1934, in the midst of the Depression, the worst depression in the history of the capitalist system, you had all these strikes that developed, general strikes, and a lot of people were not unionized during that time period. So these were more or less wildcat strikes. There were general strikes in 1934 throughout the United States. This led to the formation of the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO, which later became the Confederation of Industrial Organizations.
Yes.
Now, when the CIO was formed, it was very radical because prior to that, yeah, well, the AFL was already in existence, and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, were very racist. Either they refused to organize Black people, or they organized them into separate unions. But the CIO in 1934 probably had a lot to do with the influence of the Communist Party and perhaps the left wing of the Socialist Party, said they were going to organize all workers. So in 1935, the CP, seeing this, of course, moved to the Popular Front strategy, and the National Negro Congress was formed, and so forth. But to go back to what I was saying, ITA Wallace Johnson, who was from Sierra Leone, was heavily active in the Seamen's Union. In all likelihood, he was a member of the Communist International, and he was doing a lot of work, anti-colonial work in West Africa. He was traveling to Nigeria. He even went to the Gold Coast. He set up organizing committees. He was writing articles for the African Morning Post. And after the intervention of Italy into Abyssinia in 1935, he wrote an editorial which condemned Christianity, condemned the Italian intervention in Abyssinia, and largely condemned European civilization as a whole as being a fraud, as being hypocritical. As a result of that, he was arrested. Him and Nnamdi Azikiwe, my namesake,
Yes.
who was a journalist as well from Nigeria, they were deported from the Gold Coast. So he was doing a lot of work during this time period, the 30s, the 1940s, and of course, after World War II, in Manchester in October of 1945, there was a convening of the Fifth Pan-African Congress. But prior to that was the formation of the World Federation of Trade Unions. And that was largely done at the aegis of the Soviet Union and the Socialist Camp International. So there was an interconnection between the formation of the World Federation of Trade Unions and the Fifth Pan-African Congress that was held in late October of 1945. So ITA Wallace Johnson, a Sierra Leonean, was heavily involved in this entire process.
So, how did Sierra Leone gain independence, and was it one of peaceful transfer or one of violent struggle? And then tell us when Sierra Leone, I believe it was still a constitutional monarch with the late Queen Elizabeth II as the ceremonial head of state. But the prime minister, the first democratically elected prime minister of Sierra Leone, was Sir Milton Morgai, who died in
Yes.
August. His successor was his brother Albert Morgai and Sikai
Right.
Stevens. And Milton Albert Morgai, both were part of the right-wing Sierra Leone's People's Party. And I don't know if they're still members, but on Wikipedia, Wikipedia says that they are members of the International Democracy Union's African Regional Continent-wide branch, Democrat Union of Africa. This is where all the major center-right, far-right parties meet to see how they can help one another out and advance the global right-wing agenda. Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada of the Conservative Party, is the chairman. The deputy chairman is a member of the Liberal Party of Australia. And members include the Republican Party of the US, the National Party of New Zealand, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, the New Democracy of Greece, the Christian Democrats of Germany, Likud of Israel, Forza Italia, and Brothers of Italy. The People's Power Party of South Korea, which tried to do a coup in South Korea, which People Power Movement luckily fended off. The KMT of Taiwan, and a bunch of other basket of deplorables from Latin America and Africa and beyond. Now, apparently, the party I mentioned of Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone People's Party, has completely transformed to a center-left party. But don't be fooled, as the ideology embraces liberalism, centrism, which often translates to right-leaning on socioeconomics, and the ideology of Tony Blair, which is third way, when many left-leaning or center-left parties just pivoted hard to the economic rights and the social rights. So all that being said, how do you assess the first two prime ministers of Sierra Leone's socioeconomic legacy, and that of Sikai Stevens and his left-leaning, soft-left, all-people's Congress? Very curious.
Congress, yes. Well, you mentioned first about the independence process.
Yeah.
And in 1945, at the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the slogan was to move towards independence as fast as possible. And some of the leading figures who were at that meeting were Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was there. He was a secretary. Dr. W.B. Du Bois served as the chairman of the Fifth Pan-African Congress. Jomo Kenyatta was there as well from Kenya, and others who were involved in this Congress that was held in October of 1945. And Nkrumah went back to the Gold Coast in 1947. He remained in Britain for 2 more years. There, they had set up a Pan-Africanist organization, which he was heavily involved in. He was also attempting to get a PhD from the London School of Economics, which did not happen because of his organizing activities consumed all of his time. trying to survive and trying to organize at the same time. But then in 1947, he was invited back to the Gold Coast by a group called the United Gold Coast Convention. But we've already gone over that in a previous episode. But ITA Wallace Johnson was involved in the whole independence process in Sierra Leone and throughout West Africa. There were large-scale rebellions in 1955 and 1956 in Sierra Leone. This created the conditions for the beginning of negotiations in 1957 for a transition to independence. Remember, Sudan gained its independence on January 1st of 1956. Ghana gained its independence on March 6th of 1957, the following year. Tunisia was independent in 1956, Libya in 1951. So it was a whole process of independence. Morocco in 1956. So it was a whole independence process that was taking place during the early and to the mid to the late 1950s in Africa. So in 1960, it was decided that there would be independence in 1961. And as you mentioned, Milton Margai of the Sierra Leone People's Party became the first leader of the government there. He served between 1961 and 1964, and then he died in 1964, and his brother took over after that, Albert Margai.
And what's their legacy socioeconomic economic wise? Because because it sounds to me on paper that they were actually very much a right leaning party. So did they not really overturn the centuries of settler colonialism, black capitalism, and basically the model of British colonialism? Did they not really overturn that when they were in power, or?
No, I don't think they did. And that's why there was dissent and unrest inside the country. And after the death of Milton Margai, Albert Margai took over. And later he was overthrown in 1967 by a military coup. But I wanted to mention before that,
Yes.
ITA Wallace Johnson, to illustrate what a central figure he was in West Africa, he formed what was known as the West African Youth League during the 1940s. But even prior to that, there had been organizations going on in West Africa. The Congress of British West Africa was an organization that was formed largely by people from the Gold Coast. And they perceived the coming of the national independence movement later on in the century. So you had the National Congress of British West Africa. There was the West African Youth League. So these organizations were already well underway by the 1950s and the early 1960s. So in 1967, there was a military coup by a brigadier in Sierra Leone.
Against Albert Margai.
Yeah, he was overthrown.
Okay.
Yeah, right. He was overthrown by a military junta.
Okay, and then and then the person who comes in power is Sakai Stevens, correct?
That was after the military situation.
Okay.
What happened was that
okay, so talk to us about
there's
the
a coup in
ouster
1967.
Yeah, so talk to us about that and Sakai
Yeah.
Stevens and their legacy, if there's any to speak of when it comes to socioeconomics for the majority poor Sierra Leone's.
Yeah, even though Albert Margai was not a leftist in any way, when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in February of 1966, he did send a letter to Nkrumah, which is reprinted in a book by Nkrumah called Dark Days in Ghana. The book came out, I believe, in 1967 or 68. And that book is a description by Nkrumah of how the coup took place, which removed his government from office. But in that book, he has a number of letters that were written by other African heads of state supporting him and denouncing the coup. So Margai did denounce the coup, which was CIA-backed against Nkrumah. But that did not, save him from being overthrown. But the masses in Sierra Leone actually rose up. And by 1970, the military regime had to step down. and they returned to civilian rule in 1970. And that went on for a number of years up into the early 1990s.
So, so I have to ask this question. So Sierra Leone finds itself under military rule, uh, but, uh, but the military rule, is it safe to say that the military rule was very far right or not so much?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah,
Okay, that
yeah, it was
okay
definitely,
that
it was
okay.
not progressive, it was not revolutionary at all. And later on, the All People's Congress as a party took power in
Okay,
Sierra Leone.
actually,
Yeah,
so before we get into
it
those,
became a
okay,
one-party state
okay, so
during that
interesting.
period.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So David Lanzana, the first military rule, was in power for only 2 days, March 21st to 23rd, 1967. Then Leslie William Lee in office from the 23rd to the 28th of March, 1967. Then Andrew Jackson Smith, 28th of March, 1967 to April 18th, 1968. And then he was ousted in a coup and replaced by John Amandu Bangarai, April 18th to the 20 to April 22nd, 1968. Only 4 days. So how do you assess these military folks left in socioeconomic terms for the majority working class poor in Sierra Leone? And then we'll talk about Sakai Stevens.
Yeah, it was a bad situation. There was a whole rash of military coups in West Africa during this time period. In 1966, in January, there was the first attempted coup in Nigeria. Then there was another coup after that. And then in late 1966, there were massacres of the Igbo people in the north of Nigeria, which led to a successionist civil war between 1967 and 1970, led by Ojukwu, who wanted to create a nation of Biafra in southeast Nigeria. Very disastrous period in West Africa. And there were other coups. We talked about the coup against Kwame Nkrumah in 1968, the coup against Modibo Keita. 1969 in East Africa, there was a coup, which was a left-wing coup in Somalia.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of instability, and a lot of that had to do with the character of European colonialism. They divided the African people. They tried to create elites which were separated from the masses of the people, and it was built in through the post-independence process in many countries that inevitably the civilian governments would collapse. They would be replaced by military governments, and in some cases, the Western imperialists supported these military coups d'etats. For example, in Ghana, they supported that coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, it's documented now that the CIA and the State Department engineered his removal in 1966. So, yes, in Sierra Leone, there were a series of coups during that time period, 1967, 68. Yes.
So then, and as you mentioned, they were all very much, far right, and there was lots of resistance to their policies. So then you have Sakai Stevens, who was able to mount a huge political comeback, and he and his All People's Congress, they come back in power. They impose a one-party state. He serves April 21st, 1971 to November 28th, 1985, when he there's a lot of debate on whether he voluntarily stepped down or he was forced to
Mm-hmm.
retire. But how was his time in office second time around? Did he leave behind a good socio-economic legacy for Sierra Leone? And then how do you assess that same legacy for Joseph Sadu Momfo, who stays in office from November 28th, 1985 to April 29th, 1992, when until he himself also overthrown in the military coup. So yeah, here I go.
Yeah, well, they were heavily reliant upon the mining industry, particularly diamonds and bauxite. So that was the primary economic engine of growth inside the country. There was huge unemployment, and there was huge opposition to the instability within the state apparatus. So this led to mass demonstrations and other forms of unrest. And eventually in 1970, the military was forced to relinquish power. And then, of course, the period you just mentioned was also a period of stagnation. did not lead to prosperity and stability on the part of these Sierra Leonean workers, farmers, and youth. So eventually, the government was overthrown again in the early 1990s, which led to another series of coups and an eventual civil war.
Uh, yes, from March 23rd, 1991 to January 18th, 2002, Sierra Leone, like its neighbor country, Liberia, was engulfed in, and it's an understatement to say the following, a horrendous civil war. For
Mm-hmm.
global audiences like Liberia, there was the use of conflict diamonds, child soldiers. Both sides, the government, the Western-backed government, and the rebel forces did unspeakable atrocities to one another, and anyone who was very unlucky to be caught in the crossfire and in between those. Uh, internationally,
Exactly.
and internationally, Sierra Leone became known around the world when the movie Blood Diamond, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Jennifer Connelly, and quite a well-known African actor from Benin, who's also half American from the U.S. Digimon Honsu came out in 2006. Now,
Yeah, he
what's
was
your
also in Amistad, the movie
yes,
Amistad
exactly,
in the
exactly,
late
exactly.
1990s. He really became a star after that movie. Yeah.
Yes, 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 exactly. Very popular film by Steven Spielberg. Now,
Yeah, and it was
what?
about a slave revolt on a ship, the Amistad, where the Africans actually took over the ship and commandeered it to the United States and then demanded that they be released and sent back to Africa, which actually happened, interestingly enough. Go ahead.
Exactly, which actually happened. The Supreme Court of the racist Supreme Court of the U.S. actually sided with the Africans and said this is illegal. This does violate.
Yeah.
That's very interesting in and of
Mm-hmm.
itself. So, what's your assessment of the Sierra Leone Civil War? And also, I have to just say this regarding the film Blood Diamond. It is a great movie, but I actually wound up years later watching a really good documentary on the Sierra Leone Civil War, and like and now what now here's interesting. So Blood Diamond I indicts both sides of the conflict, but leans more towards denouncing the rebels. The documentary I've seen on the Sierra Leone Civil War, called "The Empire in Africa," heavily denounces the United Nations led by Kofi Annan, the Western superpowers, namely the US and Britain, and their allies, notably ECOMOG, with a largely Nigerian peacekeepers, as being the main culprits, instigators, and serial war criminals and human rights abusers in the war. So, all that being said, I'm very curious how you assess the Sierra Leone Civil War, and what was and of course what was Charles Taylor and his armed groups and loyalist connection to the Sierra Leone War, because the Sierra Leone Civil War is very much connected to the gruesome two civil wars in Liberia. Very curious your response.
Yes, those two countries, which have similar histories, uh, the developments during the late 1980s and the 1990s were horrendous. And the Civil War in Liberia had already broken out with the overthrow of Samuel Doe and the ascendancy of Charles Taylor. And then, of course, Prince Johnson, who was also a rebel leader in Liberia, was involved in all of that. And many, many people died and they were displaced. It also triggered coups d'etats in Sierra Leone. In 1992, a lower ranking military officer named Strasser, last name was Strasser,
Yes, I have
took
a question
power.
about him. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for a period of time. And there was some, enthusiasm thinking that he was going to turn the situation around. He would be able to end the war that was being waged by the RUF, the so-called Revolutionary United Front that was headed by Foday Sanko. And I don't believe it was revolutionary at all in terms of what the actions they were carrying out against the civilians in Sierra Leone. But Strasser did not last long, and there were additional military coups d'etats. ECOMOG, you mentioned, the Economic Community of West African States military force sent in forces to both Liberia and Sierra Leone. And in
Did
Sierra
and
Leone,
did unspeak
the
and also
president was returned in 1988,
and also did unspeakable crimes against
1998, excuse me. Yeah,
humanity.
go ahead.
Oh no,
Could you repeat that?
no, I was just saying that the ECOMOG, the mostly Nigerian peacekeeping
Troops.
force, also did just horrendous crimes against humanity towards civilians. Funny that they suspected was part of the RUF. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this went on for years, 1990 up until about 1998. And then President Koroma was returned to Sierra Leone to office by ECOWAS, but there was coordination, by the Economic Community of Economic Community of West African States. So in 1998, there was a return to some semblance of normalcy and stability. Yet, things continue to deteriorate, particularly in neighboring Liberia.
Yes, and I have to ask this question: what was Charles Taylor's role in in the Sierra Leone civil war? From the research I did on the ChatGPT and some other places, it said that Charles Taylor basically uh, needed conflict diamond. Basically, he teams up with the RUF to destabilize Sierra Leone. Uses a lot of the conflict diamond to install himself into power and continue his reign of terror in
Yes.
in Liberia. So do talk to us about that. And also, I'm very glad you mentioned how the RUF was not a revolution. Was not a positive left wing revolutionary stuff, because when rewatching the documentary Empire in Africa, which is about the Sierra Leone Civil War, it strongly condemns the West, rightly so. Strongly condemns the United Nations, rightly so. But I felt with rewatching the documentary, having done the research we've done on Liberia and so
Right.
forth, knowing Charles Taylor, I mean, now we can criticize the the War Crimes Tribunal and so forth, which we will later. But Charles Taylor was not some force for good. Was not some force for good, and the RUF, although I think far too many of them were prosecuted when it should have been everybody, because there were really no good guys or bad guys in the Sierra Leone War. But I did feel that the documentary I saw was far too soft on the RUF. That's why I find it quite interesting that you say, like,
Mm-hmm.
no, the RUF was not some revolutionary force that us leftists and anti-imperialists should even rally behind. So I'm very curious.
Yeah, there were some people who were fooled by the name. They knew Sierra Leone as a, outpost of neocolonialism in West Africa, but at the same time, the tactics used by the RAF was definitely not revolutionary at all. And it was never clear what their strategy was beyond seizing power uh, in uh, in Freetown. The Freetown that was set up by the British colonialists. So yeah, it's a very interesting period in Sierra Leone as well as Liberian history. The Koroma was returned to power in 1998, but Charles Taylor still continued uh, to rule in Liberia for several years, perhaps 5 years after that.
And ran very much a far right a government. And in fact, here's an interesting thing which shocked me, which actually shocks me about Charles Taylor and Samuel Doe before him.
Right.
Samuel
Who
Doe was
overthrew the civilian government
yes.
of Talbot. Yeah.
Exactly. So Samuel Doe overthrows this right leaning government, civilian government, of Liberia, and basically installs a horrendous far right regime of terror, and he gets overthrown by Charles Taylor. Now, what's interesting this, and Charles Taylor also, waged a far right reign of terror on on his enemies. But here's a very interesting. But here's a very interesting thing which people don't realize is Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who's considered this feminist icon. She's this darling of the West, even though she's allied with the global right wing movement, as I mentioned, the International Democracy Union. She
Yeah,
herself supported Charles Taylor's coup against Samuel Doe. And one of the reasons why there's never been a proper war crimes tribunal in Liberia is because the very people who did all the investigation into how the war broke out and so forth all said that people like Ellen like Ella Sirleaf Johnson should be barred from office for at least 30 years because of their
wow.
roles in backing the different factions. And this gets completely missed when
Hmm.
she's covered in mostly Western corporate media, Western state media, but even African media completely omits this. And I just find that is just so uh, scandalous.
Hmm.
There's really no other words. So I'm yeah. Your
Well,
response.
Samuel Doe was the first non-Americo-Liberian to take charge in Liberia. Charles Taylor ostensibly was an Americo-Liberian as well. So I don't know if that was the connection between Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Charles Taylor, but I do not believe, and it would be hard to believe, that she would continue to support what he did after the coup in 1990 that brought him to power. But hey, who knows? Like I said, all of the leaders from 1822, when the settlements were first established, and then in 1847, when they declared a republic of Liberia, all of the heads of state were so-called Americo-Liberians, who are Africans, but who were enslaved in the West and who were resettled in Liberia during the 19th century. So, yeah, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is part of the Americo-Liberian sector of the population of that country. She was highly educated as an economist, and she was supported by the West, in an
Because
effort to restabilize Liberia as an outpost of neocolonialism. Yes,
because well, she was Harvard educated and
yes.
she works in the World Bank. She's not going to be a flaming left winger, obviously, but it's just it's just so
No, in most
scandalous.
cases, she'd be considered a traitor if she had turned
Exactly.
to a leftist. If
I
she
mean,
had have
this
been
is
somebody like, for example, ITA Wallace Johnson, who was a Marxist and a Pan Africanist, they wouldn't have supported her. In fact, ITA Wallace Johnson died in Ghana in 1965, supposedly in a car accident. Um, so I just wanted to throw that in. His life ended in 1965 in Ghana. Just wanted to mention that. But his politics represents an antithesis to the politics of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first woman elected as president on the African continent.
unbelievable. But before we talk about the end of the Sierra Leone Civil War, just very briefly, Captain Valentine Strasner, May 1st,
Yes.
1992 to January 16, 1996, he was ousted in the military coup. Julius Bio was in office for 73 days, January 16th to March 29, 1996. Very briefly, how do you assess their time in office during this gruesome civil war?
They were not able to end the Civil War, and that's what was the failure of their administrations. Since they were military people, it was thought that they could do a better job in regard to fighting the RUF and bringing stability to the country, but they were not able to do so. So that's
Okay.
why I would take the intervention of the ECOMOG to actually defeat the RUF and to bring civilian rule back to Sierra Leone around 1998.
So the Sierra Leone civil war ends with the government of Sierra Leone, backed by the West and key Western African governments, wins. Civilian government is formally restored, and it's led by Ahmed Tijan Kaba of the SLPP, the Sierra Leone People's Party, who've made a comeback. How do you assess his legacy? He served an entire year in office until, again, he was overthrown in a military coup, May 25th, 1997, led by Major Johnny Paul Karoma, whose rebel forces, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, AFRC, took control of the capital May 25th, 1997, until he himself was ousted by ECOWAS a year later in February 12th, 1998. And then the person who replaces him was, again, none other than Ahmed Tijan Kaba of the SLP, the Sierra Leone People's Party. He's made yet another political comeback, and he serves February 12th, 1998 to September 2007. Abayomi, how do you assess this time in Sierra Leone and the legacy? The first Kaba government, the military that replaces him, and then the Kaba comebacks. And then the socioeconomic wise for the mostly poor and severely struggling and deprived people of Sierra Leone. How do you assess their legacy?
Well, I mean, civilians, a lot of people in the international community considered the return of President Kaba as a victory, against the rebels and the chaos that was going on inside of Liberia, inside of Sierra Leone.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was, as you mentioned, it was connected with the civil war that was taking place in Liberia as well. And during that war, they introduced drugs and sexual violence and all these things that were utilized to suppress the population. So people felt this would bring about some type of stability. It did end the Civil War, yet the economy was in such shambles that it was not a general improvement in the social conditions of the majority of the people inside of Sierra Leone during the late 1990s and going into the 2000s.
Yes, and now and well, actually, before I get to this question, what's your assessment of Charles Taylor's role? Do you feel that him and the RUF were right to have been prosecuted for war crimes? Funnily enough, he's never been prosecuted for any crimes against humanity in Liberia. The Liberian elites and so forth basically wanted, okay, we because so many of them would have been implicated in war crimes and so forth like that, and many basically, it was just see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. The war is done. Here's this woman as your president. Move on. Even though Ellen Johnson, many people who were war criminals were put in place in government. But Charles Taylor's never been prosecuted for any crimes against humanity he's done in Liberia. He has been prosecuted for crimes against humanity and other unspeakable crimes for Sierra Leone. So, what's your assessment of the special war crimes?
Tribunal on Sierra Leone?
Yeah, I'm very curious your response.
Yeah, well, it was very interesting because Taylor left Liberia as a result of negotiations that was led by ECOWAS. And he agreed to leave Liberia and to go to Nigeria, to leave politics. But eventually he was betrayed and turned over to this tribunal, this special tribunal on Sierra Leone. So it did, you don't have the problems in Sierra Leone today, by no means, that you had during the 1990s. So in that sense, it has been positive. But the prosecution of Charles Taylor for his crimes connected with the RUF in Sierra Leone, was inadequate, in my opinion. And I think that more should have been brought out, as you mentioned, about the documentaries showing the role of the United States, the United Nations, in not dealing with the problem as it was developing. So I think Charles Taylor was targeted. The NPFL was targeted by the West during the early 2000s after the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In 2001, September 11th. they started accusing Charles Taylor of harboring Al Qaeda people in Liberia. Now he denied it. He said, I don't, how do we know who's Al Qaeda? They're underground anyway. They could be here and they may not be. But he said he had no conscious
I
involvement
didn't know
with the
that.
Al Qaeda organization. Yeah, this was during his last days in Liberia, and then of course there was negotiated departure led by ECOWAS. Uh, and eventually there was a bounty put out for him, and eventually he had to stand trial in this special tribunal on Sierra Leone.
Yeah, he's currently serving. I mean, his punishment was 50 years in jail, which was more or less considered a life sentence. And funnily enough, he's actually not serving. He's not in the prison cell in The Hague, not in the prison cell in Sierra Leone. Is in a prison cell, funnily enough, in yours truly, Britain. It's safe to is it safe to say that what happened in Sierra Leone, in which it was a victor's justice, kind of like World War II, yeah, was a victor's justice in which the people who quote unquote won the war, the Western-backed Sierra Leone government, all of their crimes against humanity were basically wiped clean, and it was only Charles Taylor and the
Yes.
RAF who were prosecuted for war crimes. I mean, we see a replica of this in Rwanda, where Paul Kagame's enemies are all thrown in jail, but not Paul Kagame, who himself, and we all know the real story of Paul Kagame. But that's basically like what happened in Sierra Leone.
Yes, it's very political. The whole resolution of his removal from Liberia and to Nigeria, and of course, the establishment of a special tribunal on Sierra Leone was very selective in regard to prosecution. And we've seen this repeatedly, even with the formation of the International Criminal Court. During its early phase, they only focused on African rebel leaders or African heads of state. And they said they were going to do an investigation of the United States in regard to torture in Afghanistan. The U.S. told them, don't you dare try it, and that was the end of it. The United States is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court. So yet they're willing to use the ICC against their enemies in Africa. So the ICC has been discredited, and African governments, some have withdrawn from it, some have threatened to withdraw and have not done so for international and diplomacy reasons, economic reasons as well. So it's clearly a very biased institution. And the fact that it's based in the Netherlands, we've talked about the Netherlands, the Dutch Africa Company, the Dutch East India Company. These people looted and plundered West Africa for at least 2 centuries, between the 17th and the 19th century, until they were overshadowed by other European powers such as France and Britain. So for the Netherlands to be housing a court dealing with international crimes is really the profound irony of the international community since the beginning of this century, because they've never been held to account for the crimes they committed against Africans and for the colonization and enslavement of African people. They apologized several years ago in a trip to the Caribbean, but the Black activists there rejected this apology. They want reparations in order to make amends for the role of the Netherlands during the Atlantic slave trade in the period of classical colonialism.
And of course, the Netherlands also is a member of NATO. That pan
Exactly.
that
The
that
chair
that
right
that,
now
that
is Dutch, right?
yes,
The
yes.
chair of the North Atlantic.
Mark Rutte of the very right wing party VVD, which is also a member of all these right wing clubs that we talked about, and yeah,
And
Netherlands.
Trump supported him. He went to the White House, remember, earlier this year?
Yeah,
And Trump said, yeah, I supported you. I think you're a good person. to be the Secretary General of the
Well,
North
you know,
Atlantic Treaty Organization.
the Netherlands is a member of NATO, and it's
Right.
not talked about much. And it's
Mhm.
incredible how it's actually not talked about much uh, in in the Netherlands and outside. But the Netherlands was also part of the coalition of the willing war criminals when it comes to Iraq and so forth. So and you know, you were talking about colonialism, but when I think of the Dutch colonialism, I think of course of, you know, Indonesia and so forth and that brutality. So
And also, the people, Jan van Riebeck and the others, they came from the Netherlands, who went around the Cape of Good Hope and established the settlements in South Africa in 1652. He even brought slaves to South Africa in 1652 from other parts of Africa. So they were instrumental in setting up the settler colonial system in Southern Africa.
so yeah, no, so that's why, you know, happy Charles Taylor and any RUF war criminals have been brought to justice, but it's only victory half won because there were no good guys in that grotesque civil war, and in
Mhm.
Liberia, many people have just been justice has escaped, you know, all the crimes against humanity that each Liberian government, except for the one very brief left one, was in power. So, but now when we go back to, but now going back to Sierra Leone, so after all these unstable governments comes into power, the All People's Congress returns to power, led by Ernest Bai Koroma, comes to
Roma,
power
yes.
September 17, 2007 to April 4th, 2018. Any good socialist legacy that he leaves behind, Abayomi, or was he one of those talks from the left, governs from the right, or is even forced to govern to the reactionary junk economics of the right because of, you know, the International Monetary Fund and whatnot? I'm very curious.
Yeah, all of that. The IMF, the World Bank, largely sets the standard for the organization of post-independence African states. And the whole notion that you have to reduce the size of the civil service, you have to cut back on subsidies for education, not only primary, secondary, but also higher education as well. So no, there was no radical economic program to transform Sierra Leone into a socialist state, even a non-capitalist state. It has not happened yet, as far as I'm concerned.
And Sierra Leone is currently under the leadership of the SLPP again, the Sierra Leone People's Party again, and it's under the leadership of Julius Maada Bio. Now, historically, the SLPP was a right-wing African capitalist party, but apparently they have shifted more to the left, but very much embracing the neoliberalism and the economic right-wing agenda of Tony Blair, known as Third Way, or Bill Clinton's centrism, which is very right leaning, very economic, hard right, and socially regressive. So I'm curious, what's your assessment of Sierra Leone today under the SLPP and comeback kid, Julius Maada Bio?
Yeah, I think that they're still trying to recuperate from that horrendous civil war. If you look at the situation right now in West Africa, a lot of the economies are suffering due to the lack of infrastructural development. There's still a international division of labor and economic power that is disadvantageous to African people. And all of these small states, fragmented states, which were established by European imperialism, are not effective in regard to governance or economic policy. And President Bio is facing the same challenges that every other president of Sierra Leone has faced since 1961, even prior to 1961, because the whole transitional process was flawed. And the whole idea of the liberated Africans populating Sierra Leone was in actuality a misnomer. It was an experiment on the part of Britain to dump unwanted Africans who were no longer needed to work back to Africa, but at the same time where the Europeans were maintaining control over the resources, the land, and the labor. So that process is continuing all the way to 2025. We're here in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, and there's still huge problems that are taking place in West Africa. And unfortunately, it appears as if things will get worse under Trump. He invited 5 West African leaders to the White House earlier this year. It's obvious he knows absolutely nothing about the history and the politics of West Africa. He asked the president of Liberia, Bokai, how did he learn to speak English so well? So this is the mentality. Now they're targeting Nigeria, saying that the government there is targeting Christians for persecution and genocide. It's totally outrageous. And the Nigerian government has rejected it. And interestingly enough, the People's Republic of China came out condemning what Trump had said in support of the government in Nigeria, which is a pro-capitalist government. It's by no means revolutionary, even though it's the largest, most populated state in Africa. Large supplies of crude oil, natural gas, and other strategic minerals and resources, but still, there has to be unity brought about. Way back in 1920, there was a formation of the Congress of British West Africa. And I mentioned this before, but the whole idea was to bring together the entire West Africa region as an economic and political bloc. Now, here we are 105 years later, and we have ECOWAS, but ECOWAS is still being dominated by Britain and the United States and other imperialist states. And that's why the Alliance of Sahel States was formed nearly 2 years ago by Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But there are problems now, even in the AES. But Sierra Leone has not agreed to join the AES, and other countries have not agreed to join it. For example, Senegal. There was a big rebellion and uprising there back in 2023. It brought about elections. And in 2024, there was a new government that was brought in. President Faye was brought in. He did not join them, the AES. And he did go to France and met with Emmanuel Macron. So it's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the West Africa region to end capitalist domination and to bring about some form of socialism in the region. Yes.
Well, historically, where was Sierra Leone placed during the Cold War? Was it more aligned with the UK, the US, Canada, and Britain's puppets in what's known as the Commonwealth and NATO, or was it more or was it more non-aligned and enjoyed friendly relations with the USSR, China, Cuba, Vietnam, the Eastern European Communist bloc, or was it more part of the Western imperial orbits?
Yeah, I would say non-aligned, but at the same time, more closely leaning towards Western imperialism. That doesn't mean that there was nothing positive or progressive going on inside the country. They do have a strong tendency, from people like ITA Wallace Johnson and others who have leftist ideas and are trade unionists. But between 1961 and 1967, it was largely remained in the Western imperialist camp, economically and politically.
And how is Sierra Leone's relations with BRICS collectively, or members of BRICS? Any relations good unless Western imperialists try to sabotage those relations?
Yeah, I don't think they've been invited to join BRICS. They may be interested in joining, but the country is small and it still has to recuperate from decades of destabilization and underdevelopment. I don't see them joining BRICS anytime soon. The African countries that have joined BRICS, the Republic of South Africa and Ethiopia and Egypt, have stronger economies and much larger populations. So the BRICS is a very promising economic union, and it's really terrifying the U.S. and the Western imperialist countries, even though it's not categorically socialist oriented or anti-imperialist. You have different political tendencies within the BRICS summit. For example, Brazil, its president is more or less a social democrat, Lula da Silva, although he has been speaking out strongly against the United States and its attacks that have been taking place in the Caribbean against Venezuela. And you also have Russia, where socialism was overthrown during the early 1990s, but there are serious contradictions between the Russian Federation and the United States. They are by no means in the same political camp. Russia refers to the United States and Western Europe as the West. That's what the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, referred to them as, quote, the West. Now, the West doesn't consider Russia as a part of them, and therefore Russia doesn't consider themselves as part of the West. And the strategy of Trump, obviously, was to try to break away Russia from China into an alliance with the United States so they could focus attention on destabilizing the People's Republic of China, but that has not happened. Russia knows that the United States does not mean them well, and therefore there has not been that alliance, even though you have all this diplomatic language back and forth between the Kremlin and the White House, but objectively they are at war in Ukraine. The U.S. is supporting the right-wing neo-fascist government of Volodymyr Zelensky, and of course, the Russian Federation is supporting those in eastern Ukraine and other parts of Ukraine that are against the fascist government there, either to form their own country or to establish some system of coexistence, as autonomous regions in eastern Ukraine. Crimea broke away. They voted to break away from the right-wing regime in Ukraine. So they got a long ways to go in terms of the U.S. imperialists, and Trump, who is facing so much domestic opposition, very difficult to see a way out for him in this scenario in terms of the Ukraine-Russian war, or what the Moscow calls the special military operation. But Sierra Leone, I would say, would be safe to say that they are non-aligned, but also leaning heavily towards the U.S. and the European Union and the U.K.
And what has been both Sierra Leone and I don't remember if I asked about Liberia last week, but what has been both Sierra Leone and Liberia's response to the African Spring, the anti-French imperial wave in Africa? And I'll just say in passing that I think one of the mistakes of what's happening amongst Burkina Faso and these and the anti-French imperialist wave is focusing too much on just French imperialism as opposed to the collective West. But that's another topic for another day, though. But that is,
yeah, I think that the fact that Liberia was set up by the United States, which came out of the British colonial system, and the fact that the other countries were formerly colonized by France, I have not heard any comments on the part of the governments in Sierra Leone or Liberia in regard to the anti-French rebellion that's been taking place principally in West Africa. So it's really not clear what their position is, what their positions are in this particular regard. But I do believe that the anti-French sentiment has a strong basis within the struggle against neocolonialism. And it's a very difficult situation for the AES because they're all landlocked countries. They're former French colonies. The French had deeply penetrated the state during the post-colonial period and the military. Over the last decade and a half, you had Operation Barkhane and the G5 of the Sahel. These are French-led military operations ostensibly designed to fight these jihadist rebels, which have been wreaking havoc across West Africa, and they have by no means defeated. Even in Mali, they've been having extreme problems recently. There's a blockade of fuel that's being coordinated by these rebel groups. People don't have fuel in the capital of Bamako. And they have also reopened dialogue with the United States in recent months around security issues and also around mining. Mali is trying to restructure the mining industry inside the country, and it was a delegation of people from the United States that went there a couple of months ago to open up discussions. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Mali over the next few weeks, because it appears as if the situation is becoming quite precarious in the capital of Bamako. And we'll have to see what happens there. The United States has ordered uh, all of its non-essential diplomatic personnel as well as nationals out of Mali. And they even put out a statement. Well, it was a news report saying that the government was on the verge of collapse in Mali. Now, whether that's true, it may not be, but it's clear that there's serious security issues that are taking place in Mali as we speak. So yes, there's still a lot of instability in West Africa. We've been discussing Sierra Leone. Prior to this, we discussed Liberia, but the former French colonies, even those that have attempted to break with French neocolonialism, are still having problems. And the interesting thing about Mali is that there's a connection to these special military operations of the Russian Federation, because Ukraine, it was revealed earlier this year, was providing assistance to the JNIM, which is the Al-Qaeda-linked insurgent Islamist Takfiri group that's fighting against the Malian military government right now. So they broke relations with Ukraine, and so did some of the other AES states, because it was quite obvious that Ukraine, which is being subsidized by the United States, armed by the United States, is sharing those arms and sharing their intelligence capacity with the JNIM rebel groups. And this was uncovered, and they were expelled from Mali in terms of their diplomatic mission. So you have the U.S. indirectly involved in trying to overthrow the government in Mali, but at the same time, the U.S. has reopened negotiations and discussions with Mali on security issues as well as mining.
And when we talk, and the second last question, because I have to ask this question, which is the mining companies, the diamond industry, the mining companies and whatnot.
Yes.
How much do they play a huge role in the ongoing plight of Sierra Leone, where most people still live on less than $1 or $2 US dollars a day? So how much do multinational diamond companies, mining companies play a role in the plight of Sierra Leone's, and how much does Britain as a country, how much do they play a role in just the reactionary affairs of Sierra Leone's affairs? Very, very curious your response.
Yeah, I think the fact that the wealth from the mining industries are not being shared equally among the workers and the farmers and the young people that live there is going to continue to cause destabilization and other problems, economic underdevelopment in Africa. And that's true of the mining companies all across the continent. In most countries, they're being extracted on the terms given by the West, yet the masses of the people are still suffering from poverty and underdevelopment. So I think that any serious government in Sierra Leone would have to address these disparities in regard to the mining industry inside that country.
And despite betrayals, setbacks, mistakes, and more, when governments calling themselves of the left when in power, not pursuing policies that could have immensely helped the majority working class, working poor, chronically unemployed, does Sierra Leone have a strong left-wing movement? And any final thoughts you want to share about how, if the nation really wants to overcome the scourge that is extreme poverty and all the terrible ills that come with it, such as people living in destitution, squalor, that the only way to eradicate it really is only through African socialism slash pan-Africanist leftism?
Yes, and I don't see a strong left-wing party at this time inside Sierra Leone, which could effectively challenge the current government of the People's Party. And I think that is needed, is definitely needed inside the country. And but at the same time, is it's really not feasible right now to think that the left is going to seize power inside Sierra Leone. Now, we may be surprised, but the way the country was so damaged during the 1990s and even prior to that, going back to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s with periodic military coups d'etats, the unfair mining contracts that have been negotiated with the diamond companies and others. No, the country is still highly underdeveloped, but the development of a strong left wing movement is possible based upon the objective conditions that exist inside Sierra Leone. So we want to encourage forces inside of Sierra Leone to organize against what we see happening right now, and that is a reconfiguration of world imperialism led by Trump. His tariffs regime, his efforts to overthrow governments in Latin America, particularly Venezuela, but also keeping the pressure on Cuba and Nicaragua, having strained relations with Brazil as well as Colombia is extremely dangerous. And I think it portends much for the African continent. We saw the threats against the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which is allied with the West.
Yeah.
So it's no protection for these African states, even though they have economic agreements with the imperialist countries, with the multinational corporations. They can still turn on you at the drop of a hat and make all types of insane allegations. The situation in Nigeria is a direct result of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism by Britain. That is the bottom line. And they divided the country during colonialism into basically three different sectors of governance: the North, the Western part of the country, and the South. And that's how they ran the country. That's how they divided people. And this played out during the post-independence period with the coup d'etats, with the Civil War between 1967 and 1970, and the ongoing secessionist sentiment that exists. They just arrested the leader of KANU, of the indigenous movement of Biafra. They're still trying to succeed from the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So I don't know who's behind them, but this would be disastrous. They have to learn the lessons of 55 to 60 years ago, that balkanization is definitely not the solution. So Sierra Leone has a long ways to go, but the objective conditions there will push people towards the left to organize based upon their own class interests.
Here's hoping that happens. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Africa edition, with our always brilliant returning champion, the historian, journalist, and Pan-Africanist leftist and anti-imperialist, and friends all people power movements, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Subscribe to both outlets, donate generously to them, and please, folks, share widely all of 1+1's content. Donate generously if you can. And the next country we'll be exploring is Mauritania, and so begins our exploration of North Africa, and that chapter
Great.
begins next week. Until then, folks, have a great weekend. All my best. Good night and good luck, and take good care until then.